Welcome to El Alamein, not the desert of strategy maps or history books, but the one where silence could kill you faster than a bullet. A place where sand didn't just shift, it breathed. Where the men who fought here feared not only the enemy ahead, but the ground beneath their boots. October 1942. Northern Egypt. Night fell like ink spilled across the dunes. Engines cooled, radios hissed, and the desert for a few seconds went utterly still. Then came the sound. A deep vibration underfoot, faint at first, like something turning over in its sleep. The men thought it was an earthquake, but there were no tremors on the record. And when they pressed their ears to the ground, some swore they heard breathing. One soldier wrote, "The sand moves when the wind does not." Another, "It hums when the engines stop." Those lines never reached the papers. They stayed in letters that never left the desert. By morning, a patrol was gone. No gunfire, no distress call, just tracks that ended mid-dune and a single helmet half-buried staring up at the sky. Command called it unstable terrain. The survivors called it something else. They called it alive. Even the locals avoided this stretch. Bedouin guides refused to cross it after dark. They called it Sir al-Rommel, the secret of the sand. They said it sleeps beneath, waiting for sound. And when the war came, the earth finally woke. But this isn't a ghost story. Not yet. This is a record of fear written in diaries and missing reports in the way men spoke softer after nightfall. You can still feel it if you listen closely, that hum under the silence. That question no one ever answered. Before we begin, take a breath. Imagine standing there, the air dry, the stars distant, and the sand shifting beneath your boots, as if it has a pulse of its own. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you'd do if the ground itself began to move. Because this is El Alamein, what moved under the sand should have never been awakened. And what happened next was never written in any war report. October 1942. The western desert lay vast and pale under the fading sun, the air shimmering like a mirror of heat. From the Mediterranean coast to the hollow of the Qattara Depression stretched the lines of the British 8th Army Infantry sappers, tank crews, men from New Zealand, India, Australia, South Africa, all waiting for the order that would begin the great offensive. For weeks they had dug in, sweating under a sun that stripped the skin, then freezing under a night sky full of cruel, beautiful stars. Some joked that even the stars looked sharp enough to kill. Others had stopped joking. They knew Rommel was out there somewhere beyond the horizon. His Africa Corps had vanished into a labyrinth of minefields, trenches, and illusion steel teeth hidden beneath the sand, decoys disguised as Rex traps that turned every step into a question of life or death. The maps meant little. The dunes changed shape each day, swallowing landmarks. Compasses sometimes spun for no reason, as if the earth itself had forgotten where north was. In the Allied camps, tension moved like static through the air. Cigarettes glowed in the dark. Typewriters clicked out orders no one would read twice. Generators coughed, then died. The desert had begun to eat sound. It seemed to draw it downward, muffling voices, muting the clatter of metal. Even laughter came out thin, brittle, and afraid. A few Bedouin guides hired to lead supply convoys refused to travel after sunset. They said the ground here was not dead. It only slept. The translators smirked, but the soldiers listened. By nightfall on October 23rd, the entire front was silent. No breeze, no hum of insects, no shifting of sand. Men spoke in whispers as if the darkness itself might hear. The order came down the line, Operation Lightfoot. Artillery crews primed their guns. Tank engines rumbled awake, heavy and reluctant. Then, at precisely 21:40 hours, the desert erupted. 882 guns fired in unison, a rolling thunder, that shook the horizon. The ground trembled. The air turned white. Men covered their ears but still felt the concussion in their chests. For 20 minutes, the desert was pure light and sound. And then, nothing. The guns fell silent. The smoke drifted away. The echoes died too quickly, like sound swallowed by cloth. The only noise left was the hiss of cooling barrels and something else. Some called it imagination. Others swore they felt it, a low vibration under their boots, not fading with the bombardment, but growing steadier, deeper, slower. One sapper said it felt like a heartbeat inside the earth. He laughed when he said it, but no one laughed back. At dawn, the world had changed. The desert looked rearranged, as if the dunes had moved during the night. Craters had filled themselves in. Tracks that once led north now curved east, ending abruptly in untouched sand. Patrols set out and never returned. A British major wrote in his field log, "Terrain unstable, possible subsurface collapse." But another entry in a soldier's private notebook read, "The sand took them." Air reconnaissance confirmed strange distortions, patterns like ripples on water, spreading from the sites of the heaviest shelling. Pilots reported faint movement across the dunes long after the wind had ceased. The footage developed later in Alexandria showed subtle waves rolling beneath the surface of the sand, as though the desert were breathing. The reels were filed away, labeled optical interference. Most were never seen again. By the third day, even victory tasted wrong. Rommel's defenses were collapsing, but the men advancing through the dust felt no triumph. Their boots sank deeper than before. Some described the sensation of the ground softening under them, then firming again, as if something inside the dune shifted position. Machine gunners complained that their tripods tilted by inches overnight. Mechanics found tanks that had sunk a foot into the soil without leaving marks around the treads. The desert was swallowing them slowly, deliberately, without sound. Local guides refused to enter certain valleys. They muttered the old name again, Sir al-Rommel, the secret of the sand. They warned the officers that too much iron, too much fire had woken something that belonged to the earth alone. When pressed to explain, one man simply drew a circle in the sand and whispered, "It listens for noise." The translator hesitated before repeating the phrase aloud. Letters written that week hinted at the unease. A corporal wrote home, "We fight the Germans by day and the desert by night." Another confessed, "Sometimes I feel it breathing through my boots." Many of those letters never arrived. Their couriers vanished somewhere between the ridges. The army listed them as missing, presumed dead. At the field hospitals near Tel El Asa, doctors noted strange patterns among the wounded. Some patients refused to sleep, claiming they could feel the floor moving. Others woke screaming that the sand was whispering names. The nurses called it desert fever, dehydration, trauma, but one physician recorded the heartbeat of a patient who insisted he could hear a pulse beneath his cot. The monitor ticked once, then twice, then another faint rhythm appeared, lower, slower, perfectly regular. It matched no bodily function. The recording was later lost. Rommel's diary for November 3rd contains a single curious line. "The desert fights differently now. It consumes rather than kills." Historians say it's a metaphor for defeat. But some who stood there remember otherwise. They said the desert wasn't a place anymore, it was a presence. It watched and waited, and every shell, every footstep, every vibration seemed to feed it. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was unbearable. The engineers sent to clear the wreckage found half-buried trucks, gun barrels protruding like bones. In some craters, the sand was smooth, almost glassy, hardened by heat or something else entirely. A young officer tried to dig through one of them. The shovel bent before it broke the surface. He wrote in his report, "Recommend no further excavation. The page ends there." Weeks later, satellites photographing the area for mapping caught faint temperature fluctuations underground, regular rhythmic pulsing every few minutes. The technicians dismissed it as equipment drift. But one of them, a veteran who had fought there as a young man, stared at the data for a long time before closing the file. "It's still breathing," he said, "and so the maps show a line of victory, a battle won. The textbooks say El Alamein was where the tide turned." But for those who were there, the story was different. They didn't talk about tactics or medals. They talked about the nights when the wind died, when the desert listened, when something beneath the sand began to stir and never truly slept again. The war remembers things that men try to forget. In the archives of the British War Office, in a plain brown folder marked El Alamein, terrain irregularities, the first reports appear almost harmless, short notes typed on thin paper and filed between supply manifests and weather data. But as the pages go on, the tone shifts. The sentences begin to tremble. The earliest entry, dated October 25, 1942, reads, "Patrol A-17 failed to report from checkpoint Bravo Siwa Road. Visibility good. No enemy contact. Last message, ground feels soft, awaiting instruction." That phrase, "ground feels soft," repeats in 4 later reports like an echo no one noticed until much later. The recovery team found their tracks halfway across a dune ending abruptly. Helmets half buried, rifles' clean safety catches still on. No sign of struggle. The report ends with 2 words, fate unknown. By October 28th, 5 patrols had disappeared. A memo from Major Ellis at Field Command calls it a developing pattern. Another note, handwritten in the margin, adds, "Similar terrain incidents occurred north of Ruwaisat Ridge, no geological explanation. The sand in that area," it said, "behaved as though hollow below the first meter. Engineers probed the ground with rods. The rods sank easily, meeting no resistance. When they tried again minutes later, the sand had hardened like stone. Mechanics from the 10th Armored Division reported tanks subsiding overnight." One log entry states Vehicle 7C sank 12 inches during the night. No tracks disturbed around site. No engine movement recorded. They assumed the sand had settled from vibrations, but when the tank was pulled free, the cavity beneath it was perfectly round, smooth walls, no trace of collapse. The pattern resembled the inside of a mold. As if one mechanic wrote, "The earth remembered the shape of the tank and tried to keep it." Lieutenant Robert Gaines of the Royal Engineers left one of the most detailed personal records. His notebook survives smudged with oil and dust. The last complete entry, camped near ridge, ground steady until 0310, detected low-frequency vibration under chassis of truck, duration approx. 23 seconds, repeated twice at interval of 7 minutes. Origin eastward movement, resonance between 8 to 9 Hz below threshold for audible sound. Felt, not heard. The next page contains only half a line. Set metal stakes to trace, and then the paper is torn. His unit vanished the following night. Their signal log shows the last transmission. Not random. Command grew uneasy. Reports multiplied. The term "living sand" began appearing in letters home scrawled by exhausted men. Officers ordered all such correspondence intercepted to prevent panic. A field directive from Colonel Harding on November 2nd reads, "Cease usage of phrase 'living sand' in official reports. Morale impact unacceptable. Refer all incidents to Engineering Division for geological classification." The Engineering Division never filed a final statement. Their last telegram to Cairo says persistent harmonic vibrations detected. Origin undetermined. Awaiting permission for core sample extraction. No permission was given. The team disappeared 3 days later. After the battle ended, the Cairo Geophysical Office attempted to study the phenomenon. Using early magnetic sensors, they recorded faint fluctuations underground, pulsing once every few minutes. The pattern persisted even when nearby engines were shut down. One analyst marked in pencil amplitude rises during silence, falls during noise. The discovery was forwarded to London and sealed under confidential, unverified. In 1948, a post-war technical commission revisited El Alamein to prepare land for memorial construction. They brought a prototype ground-penetrating radar newly developed by the Royal Geophysical Institute. The machine mapped dense layers beneath the sand, but in two locations near Ruwaysat Ridge and Tel El Isa, it registered moving cavities between 6 and 9 meters deep. The field engineer recorded echo returns inconsistent. Density shifts mid-scan. Pattern appears biological. His report was stamped defective. The film reel accompanying the test is missing from the archive. The catalog card remains with the note "Reel withdrawn, 1953." Testimonies continued for decades. In 1959, a group of surveyors reported subsurface hum audible only through metal. One held a spade to his ear and swore he could hear a pulse through the handle. The sound was steady like a mechanical rhythm, but with no machine nearby. A recording was made on magnetic tape. When played in London, the audio was silent, yet the oscillograph traced a faint waveform repeating every 5 seconds. When the technician boosted the signal, the tape snapped. The waveform vanished from the record. Officially, the British Ministry of Defence closed the file. The final summary, dated 1964, repeats the same phrase found in the earliest reports. Cause of disappearances: unstable sand and shell impact. But the men who had stood there never accepted that. One veteran, a tank commander interviewed by the BBC in 1972, said quietly, "Shells don't hum. Wind doesn't breathe. We woke something up and then we left it there." In the years since, historians have combed through the same documents, searching for rational explanations: seismic activity, gas pockets, mirage effects. Yet every investigation leads back to the same irregular patterns, the same sudden vanishing of men and machines, the same pulsing vibration that should not have existed. Some of the reports now show faint marks where words were erased, biological movement living. But the ink never truly disappears. The war ended. The sand covered everything. And in the official history, El Alamein became a story of courage, of victory, of strategy. But buried under the neat rows of medals and statistics lies a second story written in field notes, half-sentences missing pages of the moment when the desert itself seemed to rise, to breathe, and to remember. Among the men, stories began to spread not through reports or orders, but through whispers that clung to the dark like dust. They said the desert was feeding, that it had grown tired of the dead lying still and wanted the living instead. Some laughed when they heard it, but never twice. At first it was the sound, a low thud under the sand, slow, measured, deliberate, the kind of sound you felt in your teeth. It would start after midnight when the wind stopped. The ground would pulse once, pause, then again. Men lying in their tents swore they could feel it through their spines, timed to something that wasn't their heart. One night the entire camp went silent, listening. The pulse moved from one end of the ridge to the other, like footsteps passing under the earth. Then nothing. By dawn, 2 men were gone. The Bedouin guides warned them it was Sir al-Rommel, the secret of the sand, a spirit that wakes when iron bleeds into the ground. They said every explosion, every tank tread, every scream called to it, like drumming on the skin of something sleeping. "You make too much noise," one old man told them. "The desert listens." They laughed, tossed him coins, and went back to digging trenches. That night, the trench collapsed without a sound. 6 men buried alive, no trace, no bodies. The sand filled itself in as if exhaling. From then on, fear became part of the air. Soldiers started sleeping off the ground, on boxes, on fuel drums, on the hulls of wrecked trucks, anything to keep distance from the sand. The veterans taught the new recruits a rule: never put your bare hands on the ground after dark. They said it could feel your pulse. Those who forgot woke up shaking, claiming they'd felt fingers, not cold, not warm, just pressure pushing gently back from beneath the surface. Letters smuggled home told fragments of the same nightmare. "It's not wind," one wrote. "It's breathing. And it moves." Another warned, "Don't say its name. The sound carries." In the morning, mailbags, several envelopes were found sealed with sand instead of wax. No one admitted writing them. An Indian sapper named Chandra kept a diary. On October 31st, he wrote, "Saw movement behind medical tent." No breeze. Sand rose in shape of man hollow, like smoke inside glass. It leaned over Corporal Dunn, then sank back down. The next entry is scrawled sideways. "Still there when I close my eyes." He slit his own tent ropes that night trying to run. They found him half buried to the waist, skin blistered as if by heat, but the sand was cold. Others saw smaller things, shapes no bigger than a hand rippling just beneath the surface. When light touched them, they darted away, leaving trails like veins through the dunes. The Bedouin called them the desert's children. The soldiers called them crawlers. One corporal tried to catch one with a spade. He thrust it down hard, and the ground collapsed silently beneath him. His friends dug for hours. They found his helmet first. Inside was nothing but dust, fine as ash, still warm. By mid-November, superstition ruled the camp. Men spoke in whispers, walked without rhythm. They said the desert could hear patterns, that marching, drumming, even breathing in sync drew its attention. So they learned to move like ghosts. At night, they stopped whistling, stopped singing. Radios were kept off unless absolutely necessary. Silence became survival. A single cough could turn every head. One night, Lieutenant Harris decided to test it. He laughed at the fear at the shivering men. "If it's listening," he said, "let's give it something to hear." He kicked the sand and shouted into the dark. His voice echoed once, twice, then the sound bent, folding back on itself, like an echo swallowed before it returned. The next morning, his tent was gone. Not torn gone. The poles still stood, ropes intact, but the canvas had vanished. His footprints ended where the tent had been. Beneath them, the sand was smooth, glassy, and faintly warm. After that, the laughter stopped completely. No one challenged the silence. They said you could feel it watching from below, not with eyes, but with awareness, a presence pressing against your boots. Some swore they saw dunes quiver when they spoke too loudly, as though something inside was shifting closer. One New Zealander began sleeping with his rifle barrel buried in the sand, claiming he could hear whispering through the steel. On the third night, he fired 3 shots into the ground. The recoil shattered his shoulder. He screamed that something was pulling the bullets down. The next day, his weapon was found bent at the barrel. Medics reported men waking in the dark, screaming that the sand was in their mouths, their lungs, their eyes. They weren't choking, one nurse recalled later. It was like the air inside the tent had turned to powder. She remembered brushing grit from a man's eyelids and realizing it was moving, crawling away from her fingers. By the end of the campaign, the desert had its own legend. No one dared to speak its name aloud. They called it the thing under, or the hum, or simply the quiet. When soldiers from other divisions arrived later, they found strange rituals carved into routine tents raised on crates, men refusing to march in rhythm, candles lit but never blown out. They thought it was madness, until they spent a single night there. Then they stopped asking questions. The survivors who left El Alamein carried its silence with them. Some said they could still hear the low pulse in the floorboards of their homes, or in the engines of their cars when the world went quiet. One veteran swore that when he stood on sand again, any sand anywhere, it trembled once beneath his feet like something old recognizing him. He never returned to Egypt. He never slept on the ground again. Because they all knew. The desert remembers sound. And once it has heard you, it never forgets. Years passed. Nations rose and fell. The soldiers who had once stood at El Alamein grew old, their stories fading into the hush of history. But the desert, wherever men fought on sand, never truly forgot. It waited patient and vast, its silence pressed tight against the memory of thunder. Then came 1991. New war, new machines. The Gulf burned, and once more, the ground began to tremble. American convoys moving through northern Kuwait reported sinkholes opening in their path. Perfect circles, edges fused into glass, no sign of detonation. Pilots said the dunes looked as though they were exhaling. One helicopter camera caught a formation of sand collapsing in slow motion, like something stirring underneath. When engineers arrived to measure the crater, they felt it again, that deep vibration rising through their boots, low and steady, the same pulse that the British had written about 50 years earlier. The instruments registered a harmonic at 8 Hz, a frequency too low to hear, but strong enough to feel. The same number was circled in Lieutenant Gaines's notebook from 1942. An American geologist named Peters tried to record the vibration. His notes still exist. Source cannot be seismic, no tectonic activity. Pattern irregular, but sentient resonance rises when vehicles approach. When he played the recording back in camp, there was silence at first. Then a faint rhythmic breathing under the static. The tape snapped on its third playback. The recording vanished with him the next morning. His tent was found half buried, pegged perfectly in place, the ground beneath it smooth as glass. Satellite footage from that year showed dunes rippling long after the last bomb fell. Analysts labeled the anomalies thermal mirage distortion, but in the raw infrared feed you could see it. Cold air sucked down hot air, expelled, repeating every 6 seconds like respiration. The files were classified for psychological impact. The operators who reviewed them never returned to fieldwork. In 2003, when war returned to Iraq, seismic teams detected the same signature near Basra, low harmonic waves pulsing between artillery strikes, absent when the guns roared, returning the moment silence fell. It waits for quiet, one technician wrote. It listens for peace. He was dismissed for fatigue. His replacement later confirmed the same readings and added amplitude increases around human activity. Suggests reactive origin. By 2011, the motif had spread. In Libya, NATO drones recorded dunes twisting like liquid, entire slopes sinking without wind. In Syria, tanks vanished into hollows that sealed overnight. A Turkish journalist embedded with the UN peacekeepers described a night patrol that watched the desert surface moving slowly, rhythmically, until it formed a long depression stretching for miles. It was like watching something turn over in its sleep, he said. The footage was confiscated. Everywhere war touched sand, the same pattern reappeared, the hum, the collapse, the silence. Soldiers began calling it the breath. The Bedouin had a different name now, Qalb al-Sahra, the heart of the desert. They said it was not alive as men are, but alive as the earth is, an ancient rhythm that stirs when the land is wounded. You think you conquer the desert, one elder told a foreign correspondent. But the desert keeps count. Engineers learned rituals of fear disguised as safety protocol. Never stake tents after dark. Never idle engines when the air is still. Never whistle when the wind dies. Some camps banned metal hammering at night because the vibrations made the ground breathe. Others cut power completely after midnight, claiming the silence was the only way to make it sleep. Each army thought these were new precautions. None knew they were repeating what the British, the Germans, the Australians had done 80 years before. In 2014, a civilian oil survey west of Siwa registered tremors beneath old battleground coordinates, pulses perfectly matching the El Alamein pattern. The lead geophysicist reported deep resonance localized under ancient minefields. His final note before the signal cut: "Something is still moving down there." The next morning, his drill rig and crew of 6 were gone. Satellite images show a perfect depression, smooth, circular, undisturbed. The records line up across the decades like a heartbeat on an endless ECG: Egypt, Kuwait, Iraq, Libya, Syria. The pattern repeats: silence, pulse, silence again. The Earth waiting. The Earth listening. Some scientists now call it acoustic memory of conflict, as if sound itself could stain the soil. But those who have stood in those deserts say otherwise. They say it is alive, that every war feeds it, that each vibration teaches it something new, and so the thing that moved under El Alamein was never buried. It was only taught how to listen, how to wake wherever men shake the ground. Every time an engine growls, a bomb falls, a tank rolls across sand, it stirs. Not just in Egypt, but everywhere war touches earth. The motif repeats because the land remembers. And what the soldiers of 1942 warned has become prophecy. What moved under the sand should never have been awakened, because now it knows how to find its way back. The ridge had slept for 25 years. The desert had closed its eyes, the scars of tanks and men erased beneath shifting dunes. But silence in El Alamein is never peace. It is only breath drawn before another sound. In the spring of 1968, a small research convoy crossed the Katara Depression, 6 trucks, 20 men, all under the flag of science. They came with new machines, radar film cameras, and the arrogance of those who believe knowledge is armor. Their leader, Dr. Hans Richter, had read the British files, the reports of unexplained terrain anomalies. He wanted to see what war had left buried. The desert waited. For 2 days, nothing happened. The team set camp at Ruwaisat Ridge, the same site where the British engineers had vanished in 1942. They planted magnetic stakes, charted coordinates, measured the quiet. But on the 3rd night, the quiet began to move. The recordings are still preserved, the earliest ones, before the power failed. At 22:04 hours, the seismographs began registering faint waves, rhythmic, deliberate. The pen traced a perfect sine curve across the paper, looping endlessly. At 22:06, it doubled in amplitude. At 22:07, every compass needle in the camp spun west. The sky, perfectly clear, dimmed as if something enormous had passed in front of the moon. Dr. Richter described it in his notebook. The sand breathes. The ridge exhales. Frequency identical to human respiration, but magnified. It's not noise, it's memory. At 22:12, the ground gave its first warning. A single deep concussion like thunder buried miles beneath. The men froze. Cameras kept rolling. The film later recovered shows the tense, trembling sand lifting in tiny spirals. No wind, no sound except the low hum of the instruments. Then the lights failed. Witnesses who survived said the darkness came all at once, not natural, but total, a black so dense it felt heavy. They could feel the desert around them move slow, deliberate, as if something vast were turning in its sleep. Then came the light. It erupted from the ground, not the sky. A pale molten glow bursting through the dunes like breath from a furnace. The cameras caught it for 6 frames before the film melted. The glow spread in rings, rising, folding upward into a shape that no one could describe the same way. Some said it looked human. Others said it was made of dust and memory, thousands of faces twisting inside the light, screaming without sound. The air bent. Gravity seemed to reverse. Sand lifted in slow motion, curling upward like smoke and water. And then, the hum changed. It became a voice. Not words, but tone and echo of every explosion, every scream, every engine that had ever scarred this land. The ridge itself was speaking in the language of war. Richter dropped his notebook and whispered the only words the microphones caught. "It's remembering." The heat rose. Metal softened. Instruments fused. Men ran, but the ground swallowed their footprints before they made a second step. One truck was lifted clear off the surface, hung weightless in mid-air, then crumpled like paper. The shape in the light unfolded arms, or perhaps wings, spreading outward, made of sand flame and broken time. It towered, stretching from horizon to sky, a silhouette of the Earth's anger. And at its center, a single pulse of light expanded outward, brighter than dawn. Then the recordings end. At dawn, rescue planes found nothing. No camp, no vehicles. Just a crater, perfectly round edges fused into translucent glass. The crater measured 47 meters across 6 deep. At the bottom, a single object remained, a melted camera tripod, fused into the ground, like a bone fossilized in amber. The last frame on the surviving film shows a glare of white, and within it, if you look long enough, a shadow the size of a man walking across the horizon, toward the sea. When the footage reached London, half of it was missing. The developed reels flicker and burn. But at the end of one, after the image collapses into static, the audio continues. A slow, ragged breath, then a voice. Male distorted, speaking English in a whisper. We woke it. It remembers us. The British ministry classified the event as thermal ground reaction from unexploded ordnance. Yet in the margin of the final report, in faint pencil, are 4 words: it moved, it followed sound. No expedition has returned since. The crater still glows faintly under moonlight, visible from satellite. Local nomads call it Ayn al-Naum, the eye that does not sleep. They say that sometimes when the wind dies and the engines fall quiet, you can see the glass shimmer rising and falling, as if the land still breathes. And if you stand close enough, they say you can hear it through your boots. A rhythm, slow, steady, patient, waiting for the next war to call its name. The desert looks the same today, endless gold and still. Tourists come to El Alamein now, walking among rusted shells and silent memorials. They take photographs, unaware of what sleeps beneath their feet. The wind hums through empty helmets. The crosses shimmer under the same sun that once watched men vanish. Time has buried the paperwork, the witnesses, the reels of film. But time does not bury sound. Every vibration ever made here still lingers, the echo of artillery, the shuffle of boots, the final breath of men who never came home. The land carries all of it, humming softly beneath the calm. Sometimes in the hottest months, the air begins to vibrate without wind. Compasses drift. The sand trembles once as though something deep below has turned over in its sleep. Pilots passing overhead report seeing faint ripples race across the dunes, concentric waves that move even when the air is still. Locals refuse to speak after dark. They say the desert still remembers the language of war, and it hungers for its next verse. At Ruwaysat Ridge, one crater remains a bowl of fused glass, perfectly round. Geologists call it silica vitrification. The Bedouin call it the eye that watches when the world is quiet. They claim that on moonless nights, the glass fogs from within as if something underneath is breathing. In 1979, a seismic satellite recorded a faint anomaly there, one pulse every 6 seconds, steady and patient. The same rhythm as 1942. The same rhythm as 1968. Analysts erased the data calling it instrument drift. But the raw microfilm still exists somewhere, and if you amplify the noise hidden in the static, you can hear it a heartbeat slow and endless. The narration fades. The screen turns black. Only the hiss of shifting sand remains, until a whisper breaks through the static. It never sleeps. The sound fades into silence. The silence deepens into breath. And the film ends where it began in the desert waiting. You've just listened to another file from Classified Chronicles. If you want to uncover more, subscribe.